My name is Ken Dunham, and I'm a meeting coordinator for the Old Sydney Society. So I'd like to thank you for all coming out tonight. So right now we'll move to our guest speaker for this evening. And I'm very proud to say that Becky and I worked together for years. She's a former colleague, and she is now the senior archaeologist at Louisbourg. She's a very dedicated and committed researcher and has excellent people skills, which you're going to see tonight. She's going to speak on the mass graveyard that she's discovered at Louisbourg. So would you please give Becky Dunham a warm welcome, please.
Could we drop the lights a little bit?
Sure.
Great. It's very image heavy, so make sure you can see everything very well. So can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is really an archaeology story. And I'm going to tell you about the discovery. Well, it's been pretty much announced right now that it's about the discovery of a mass burial at the Fortress of Louisbourg, an 18th century mass burial. So I'm going to be telling you about basically the whole story, from how we found it and then what we figured out and all the things that we've learned since then. So to begin, clicker. I'd like to just set the stage. So Louisbourg, or the Fortress of Louisbourg, is pretty familiar to most people here, I'm sure. Well, this is a 1735 historical plan of the Fortress of Louisbourg. And what I like about this, it shows you that Louisbourg is so much more than the fortification itself. When you visit the Fortress of Louisbourg today, the circled area is pretty much what you see. 25% of the fortress, of a 60-acre fortress, has been reconstructed. But the National Historic Site encompasses the whole entire 60-acre fortress, the battlefield surrounding the fortress, on this side of the harbor, all the fishing properties along the shore, and the siege camps. It's actually an enormous site. And, well, here's a picture of the reconstruction as you see today, but I just want to sort of emphasize the point that Louisbourg is actually rather substantial, and there's a lot of stories that we have yet to tell. Now, this story is all set on Rochefort Point. And Rochefort Point is a little peninsula that extends out just outside the fortress walls, pushing out into the Atlantic Ocean at the mouth of the harbor. Now, the catalyst for this story is coastal erosion. Now, since the 18th century, sea level has risen a lot. We know from a variety of sources of information that sea level has gone up about 1 meter since the 18th century. So fortifications and domestic structures and other features that were once comfortably at a comfortable distance from the shoreline are now at the water's edge, underwater, or soon to be. So because of this, we keep a close eye on the coastline, and after heavy storms or just during certain times of the year, I'll go out and I'll do these coastal walks, and when features appear, then we document them. And another thing about coastal erosion is that it's very aggressive. I think of it as like a hand blender going along the coastline. So whenever something is exposed, it's usually very violently or aggressively, and it won't be there for long. So we want to make sure that when we find something, we document it as quickly as we can before, say, another storm comes in and washes it away. And this is what I mean by storms. I think we're all really familiar with nor'easters here, really powerful. And this is an image of a storm from 2008, actually. And what you're doing is you're looking across the Louisbourg harbor, and this strip of land is Rochefort Point, and the Atlantic Ocean is on the other side. So when you look at these waves coming in, just for a reference of scale, that monument you see in the middle is that monument you see off to the right, 20 or so feet high. So these are really substantial waves coming in, and this is really heavy energy. Now, to give you an idea how much change has happened, this is an overlay. We do this a lot with geographic information system software. We correlate modern aerial images with historical plans and field data, like point data we collect in the field. So this is showing the kind of the side of the fortress that's facing the Atlantic Ocean that gets hit the hardest. And it's mid-18th century plans overlaid with 1998 aerial. And the red dots you see are the survey points I recorded in 2006. So the green area is the modern aerial from 1998, modern-ish. And it's starting to get a little dated now when you think about it. And the black lines, of course, are identifying where the coastline was in the 18th century. So as you can see, a lot of changes happened since the 18th century, and we've already are losing some fortification walls and other features. And to give you an idea, this was the coastline in the 18th century, and also take note of where the building, these are sort of overviews of buildings, planned views of buildings and gardens and fences and such. They were in the middle of Rochefort Point in the 18th century, but now this is where the coastline is. Now they appear on the edge. So when you're finding things now, you also have to keep in mind how things don't look the same as they used to. Okay, so a big storm hits at Louisbourg on February 1st, 2006. After things calm down a bit, I go out and do a coastal walk a couple days later. And this, again, is the ocean side of the fortress. And you can see the reconstructed portion there. So as I'm walking along the coastline, there's all sorts of stuff popping out, mostly fortification features, something like this. This is a portion of the crenulated wall between two of the bastions. So these features are pretty vulnerable, and they're washed clean. It's as if someone came along and excavated them for us. It's kind of nice in that sense, but they won't last long. So we have to map all these things out, and that's what we spend the winter doing. It's very cold, but you need to do it. And there was a 10th site just up on Rochefort Point on the harbor side, on the north side of the point. And that was an innocent-looking little feature of a stone foundation. It could be a footer for a building, it could be a cellar, it could be a bunch of things we didn't know. There was definite 18th century cultural connection, and there were some soil features that are indicative of cultural activity. So we knew it was something from the 18th century that needed further attention. But this is February, the ground's frozen. Couldn't do much there. So basically I just took some survey points on it, covered it over, and said I'll wait till the spring and when things are thawed and go back to it. And that's just another view of how it looked that winter. Very innocent. So while waiting, I took that point out, and again back to GIS, and I correlated it with historic plans. So this is a 1744 view of Louisbourg. We're lucky we have lots of historical plans to work with at Louisbourg. It really is wonderful. We have more for certain time periods than other time periods, but we have a lot of data to work with. And the red dot marks the location, basically, of where that little stone feature was located. And so it lines up very nicely with the Saint Marie property. And there were 3 properties on Rochefort Point in the first half of the 18th century at Louisbourg, as you can see here, 1, 2, and 3. And they're named after the people who had the properties or owned the properties and sort of built and lived on these properties. So, so now this little feature, it looks like it's associated with the Saint Marie property. Great. And here's another view. Start looking at a little more historical information. Again, beautiful images from the 18th century sometimes. So this is a view of Rochefort Point. So again, this is a view in the harbor, and you're looking toward the fortress, all of it. And in 1731. And this is a close-up showing the Saint Marie property, the neighboring Carreau property, and the Latour property on Rochefort Point, sitting in the middle. And so this is sort of like the first half of the 18th century. And in 1739, 1740, they moved the parish cemetery out on Rochefort Point, and they sandwiched it between the Carreau and the Saint Marie properties. They moved the cemeteries a lot at Louisbourg, at least 5 times as the town grew and grew, and this was the last location for that. We also know from written records what happened to these properties. So we knew these properties were all there in the 1720s. 1720, 1725 is when most of them were established. And we also know that they were destroyed at the beginning stages of the first siege of Louisbourg, and that's well documented. And in fact, this is a letter from Philippe Joseph, actually let's be Joseph Philippe de la de Saint-Marie, stating that this is in 1753, and he's wanting compensation for the destruction of his property in 1745. And what happened is at the beginning stages of the first siege, when the New Englanders were besieging Louisbourg, or when they first arrived, the French cleared a line of fire around the fortress and burned all the properties so that it couldn't be used as a defensive position or used at all by the enemies. It's very standard 18th century warfare practice. So the 3 properties on Rochefort Point were burned at that time. So from this we know that these properties were on Rochefort Point for a relatively short period of time. And this all becomes relevant later, how it all fits in. So back to Louisbourg, spring's come, and it's time to go out and take a look at this little innocent feature, which is still a little innocent feature. We think it's to do with the Ste. Marie property, but not much else. But even then, we have to be a little careful. So again, we're talking about this location right here. And, oh, I have a star. But there are also 2 lime kilns nearby. So when we're correlating these old plans with modern imagery, you have to be careful we're not being too specific. So when we went out to do the work, we said, okay, this could be to do with the Ste. Marie property, it could be to do with these lime kilns, basically keeping an open mind. I was lucky, actually. When I went out to do the work, at the same time, the late Jean-Pierre Chrétien, who's an archaeologist with the Canadian Museum of Civilization, was running an historical archaeology course at Cape Breton University, and he came to me looking for a project for his students. And I said, oh, great. I have a quick little rescue excavation to do at Louisbourg, 2 weeks, in and out. And I said, now, there are some human remains out there. I was finding some bone. I noticed that around the cellar when it first came out, but because there was a cemetery between those 2 properties, between the Carreau and the Ste. Marie property, I assumed it had something to do with that. I said, I'll take care of that, and the students can focus on identifying or just defining the size of the structure. We'll get it documented, and off we go. So the students began, and you can see in this picture on the side here, that we got back to just identifying the back corners of the structure, and it was definitely a root cellar, nothing to do with a lime kiln. So that was figured out fine. But me on the beach, all of a sudden the bones, there's more and more and more and more bones coming out, and they're all mixed up, and they're all human bone. And it's getting a little confusing, and it all seems contained within the footprint of this structure. So I'm down on the beach scratching my head, and just near the end of the project, about 1 meter down in the back corner of the cellar, the students start coming across more bones and skulls and things. So we didn't know what we had. We had basically a mystery, and that's where it really began. So that wasn't the objective of that field project, clearly. So what we did, quite wisely, is recorded what we had uncovered, and then lined the units and backfilled the units and walked away. And what I needed to do was start a new project. And to do that, I needed to bring in some pros. I needed a physical anthropologist to help figure out what all these bones were telling us. And I needed an experienced field technicians or field crew to help sort this out. So that took a little time, and we got back in October 2006. And what we were doing this time is we wanted to figure out, okay, really open things up and make sense of this. And here's the beginning stages. But I also wanted to protect the site. Again, always thinking about that this is an eroding or a coastal area, always subject to erosion. Here we are in October 2006. Winter's starting to come in slowly. So I made sure I left a bulk. That's a section of soil in place to protect most of the site should things turn rough. And that's, again, another standard archaeological technique. It also allows us to see profiles, which is handy. So that's why it looks like that and why there's a big chunk of soil in the middle. So we began excavation, and things actually got a little more organized. Here you see the sort of plan view of the building of this 4 by 5 meter in size dry laid stone root cellar, about 1 meter deep, and many skeletons lying on the bottom. But they're all, I was finding disarticulated human bone on the beach, and that was because of coastal erosion, that hand blender effect I was telling you about. But once we started getting into a broader area, we could see carefully laid out burials, either oriented north-south or east-west, in 2 layers at the base of the cellar. So I was happy to see some sense of order coming of this. And so things were coming together. And to give you an idea of what it looked like out there, what the conditions are like, a couple short videos. I'm not a videographer, and you'll see in a sec why. Yeah, here you go. What I'm pointing out here is there's burnt wood right under the bones. The bones aren't burnt, but there's burnt wood right under them, and that becomes important for the interpretation. It's interesting working on these sites, or on a site like this, because there's no place to stand. And it becomes quite an acrobat process after a while. And for also a sense of the conditions, it runs through a couple times. I find this quite descriptive. Now these are showing the bones that are on the beach side of the bulk, and you notice the difference from the previous ones, and that is everything to do with coastal erosion and the effect of erosion on cultural resources. And not cultural resources in this case, the human remains, but the impact. So this is what we figured out. This is the archaeology side of understanding what happened in this little root cellar. So here's a profile. This is that bulk I was telling you, and we're looking back at it from the beach. And just clarify things, this is what the soil layers look like. I'll make it a little clearer with this, and I'll go through them with you. And we're going to go back through time from the modern day back to the 18th century. So the first layer is sod, sod and topsoil. And it's just a buildup of sod over a long period of time. It's a very thick layer, and that's indicative of a long period of stasis. Nothing was happening. It takes a long time for this kind of sod buildup to happen. So this is telling us nothing has happened here for a very long time. And there's a little bit of beach wash in there as well too, but nothing culturally active. Below that, there was a thick deposit of loose beach gravel and some 18th century artifacts, many nails, things like that in there, but mostly just very loose material. Beneath that was a very thick layer, well, thick or dense layer, I guess I'll say, of large stones, mostly a fossiliferous limestone. And that was interesting for us because we knew there was 2 lime kilns nearby, so this is probably stone taken from around the kiln. And also some field stone, which something that may have tumbled in from the walls and such. But very dense layer of large stones, and not fun to take out. And beneath that were the skeletons. Now, beneath the skeletons was basically your collapsed building rubble. And you notice on one side it's quite thick, and other sides it's rather thin, and in some places there's nothing there at all. The thick side was almost like a chimney collapse coming into the cellar, and then it draped down and sloped down going the other way. So the skeletons were quite high on one side on this rubble and quite low on the other. And that had an effect on the preservation of the human remains because the skeletons that were higher up were much better preserved than the ones that were in the wet, low area. Now beneath that we had the floor of the cellar and a lot of 18th century artifacts. There was a wooden sandbox in the corner, there was a stone walkway or a pave that ran down the middle, and a lot of evidence of burning on the burnt floor. So that is the soil profile. And in some places, I mentioned the rubble beneath the bones wasn't continuous. And in those locations is where we could tell that the bones were lying directly on the burning or the burnt floor. So that's the archaeology connection that was important to us, is the burning or the destruction of this property, and immediately after that, the burials. There was no soil development, no activity that happened between these 2 events. And that's what helps us give a timeline. In archaeology, that's called relative dating. Now, the activities and the time and the soil layers, the objects in it can give you an absolute date, but looking, comparing, or just seeing how things layer up is what we use to date things. So, going to the historical evidence, the archaeology evidence says, okay, these people were buried after this building was burned. And I already talked about how we know this building was burned, or this house was burned in 1745. So the next question is, why are they burying, or someone burying a whole bunch of people, in this case 45 people, in a 4 by 5 meter root cellar in the 18th century. And this is what makes historical archaeology so great, because with the historical information, the archaeology information, you can really figure things out. So I'd already mentioned that the 1745 was the first siege of Louisbourg. And what happened in that siege is about 8,000 New England soldiers, primarily militia, and mostly from Massachusetts, which at the time, of course, included Maine, and other states around it, but mostly from Massachusetts, sailed up here, besieged Louisbourg. They had to take Louisbourg. There wasn't a huge force, but they were a determined force. And militia, when we talk about militia, we're talking about a population of people. They're not regular soldiers. They're the farmers, and they're the fishermen, and they're everyone who volunteer to go out and fight these wars. So they come up and they besiege Louisbourg. It takes about 7 weeks. It's a full-on siege, and they take the fortress. Now, again, this was the militia up here to take the fortress. They had no intention of staying. The British regulars were going to come and garrison the fortress, but they were late. And although all these New England men, soldiers, expected to go home right after the siege, 2,000 of them had to stay and garrison the fortress for the winter until the British could arrive the following spring. Something about being held up in Gibraltar and had to stay in Virginia. I don't know the whole story about what happened to the regulars, but the point is that...
A little bit of problem in Scotland at the time.
Pardon?
A little bit of problem in Scotland at the time.
Oh, was that what it was? Well, I had some bearing on those poor New Englanders. So 2,000 of them had to stay. They weren't prepared to stay. There was a bombed out fortress that had just been sort of under assault for a good 7 weeks. And they were already, during the siege, succumbing to camp fevers. And these are things like, as they mentioned in the records, dysentery and diphtheria. Dysentery particularly, they called it the bloody flux. And that was probably the worst thing. Although I was reading about how the disease effects on people is almost a double whammy effect. If there's different diseases coming around, if you happen to get hit with two, the impact of that is far greater than one or the other. And that seems to be the case in other locations. Anyway, so they were already succumbing to these camp fevers during the siege. And imagine what a winter in a bombed out fortress, and we know what the weather's like here, and it was worse then, how that impacted this community. And there are some soldiers' journals, there's 10 of them that are published actually, that talk about the winter up to a certain point. Everything sort of peters out around January, I guess. We start losing information. And they had a miserable time, and people began dying more readily, I guess. I think the worst I read about was that people were dying at a rate of 19 per day. So here's this poor community. People are dying rapidly around them. What do you do to inter the dead, especially in a place where the ground is frozen? So what we think we've come across here is a very practical solution that they adopted to bury some of their dead. In this cellar, it's eroding, so probably originally had about 50 or so people buried in there. But they saw these burnt out cellars, or at least at the Sainte Marie property, a burnt out cellar out there, and thought, this will work. And the burials were all laid out very carefully. They didn't have time, or again, probably because things were frozen, but they didn't level out the terrain there. As I mentioned, they were on the slope, they were on the rubble. So they had to adapt to what they had to work with, but they were very carefully laid out, covered with stones, covered with loose beach sand, which is probably the only loose sediments that they had available to them, and left them. So it's very sad, but it's also very practical. What they did, or what we believe they did, based on what we found. Referring to the title of this talk, Governor Knowles, Charles Knowles, he writes a letter, and it's an interesting letter because he's complaining about, he's complaining actually quite a bit about the weather at Louisbourg, and as he says here, as to this place, words are wanting to represent the severity of the weather being now such, and the misery and suffering of the troops so great as to be beyond expression and comprehension. And the letter actually goes on to say how at this point, they were just lying the dead out in the snow, waiting to be able to bury them in the spring. So it was a very tough time, and people didn't write a lot about what happened. Nobody wrote about putting burials in cellars. And we don't have a lot of information that comes after January into the spring. So what we stumbled upon on that eroding coastline was like a little snapshot of the past that we didn't have any access to before. And it just sort of popped out and presented itself. So we're lucky to get that because we almost lost it. So we figured everything out, sort of. But it's November now, and there's not much more we can do. So we said, okay, we'll close things up for the winter. And that actually was a challenge too. So how do you protect a whole lot of skeletons, cover them over, bury them over again with soil without crushing them? So we started covering the unit and filling it with foam bean bags and foam board, anything to sort of displace about half the soil that would normally go back in. And then we carefully hand shoveled the soil back over because definitely couldn't leave anything exposed during the winter months. It's just too aggressive an environment. And, but we wanted to protect them. So this is what we did. And then we were able to come back the following summer and continue on. So what we had to do now was remove all these skeletons. So we understood what was happening as best we could, and now it was time to remove the skeletons from this eroding coastline. And I think everyone is smiling here because it's not freezing for once. So we were lucky the padding we put on worked. When we peeled all the coverings off, all the bones were still intact. And then we could begin the process, or remove that bulk, and then we could begin the process of removing all the individuals one by one by one. And so we created a map of everybody, and so we just kind of kept track of everything based on these maps, and everybody had a unique identifier of sort. And that kept coming back to us the whole summer. It's like, got to keep everyone separate, got to make sure individuals are separated as individuals. And this isn't easy when they're all mixed together. In particular was the layout that made it difficult for us to work on them. Because in the two layers, the upper layer of burials were oriented perpendicular to the beach in a north-south orientation. And below them, the burials were oriented parallel to the beach in an east-west. And we could only work from the beach side, because all around us was a meter-high cellar walls. So that means that we had to keep moving the burials on top, moving them back to a certain point to be able to access the burials beneath. So you'd often be working on many individuals at the same time in this process. So it worked, but it was very slow. And this is basically how the summer went. That's pretty. So every bone would be carefully dislodged from the sediment and collected according to the individual. Okay, what I was saying there was that we had a crypt constructed for all these. We had to find a place for all these bones to go, which we didn't have. So it took about a year to have this area set aside and shelved and tested to create a new crypt. And it's located on the lower level of the King's Bastion. We were trying to get it close to the chapel that's there now. And this is what we worked out. And that's where all the bones are now, and it's locked, and there's no access. So this is, we recorded all the skeletons as we moved them, and here's most of them and how they were laid out in the cellar. Now, once the burials were removed, I could finish sort of recording of the actual root cellar itself, and that turned out to be pretty interesting too. We had a cobble sort of walkway going down the center. We had a sandbox in the corner, and I didn't know what the point of a sandbox was in the cellar, but apparently it's a traditional practice to store your root vegetables in sand. So there we go. And it's the only one that's ever been found at Louisbourg, so that was something new. And there was also a great variety of artifacts that we found on the cellar floor, a lot of domestic material. And again, this is interesting for us because these materials were from one house owned by one family that was occupied for maybe 20 to 25 years. So it has a very tight context and for me, that's great, because usually we find artifacts that could span quite a broad period of time or associated with different people, different cultures, different families. So this is actually a fairly rare thing to come across. And once we had it fully recorded, we covered it over, but then over the years, now we're looking back over time, over the years we've stopped covering it over because it's eroding, and right now about half that cellar is already gone. So, but that's okay, we can't save everything, but we can document things before they go. And we have an exhibit in the King's Bastion of some of the objects that we found representing the St. Marie family and the materials that they used when they were out there on Rochefort Point. Now, the people. We removed the skeletons, but there's so much information that skeletons can teach us. And so we had an opportunity, nature sort of gave us an opportunity to learn something. And so I'm just now going to talk to you a little bit about the people that we found and what that really showed us about a community from a long time ago that an understanding that we don't usually have access to. So this is where physical anthropology comes in. Before the skeletons were moved to the cellar, they were cleaned, the soil was cleaned off them. And we did some basic measurements to determine sex, age, height, and any evident pathologies we could see on the skeletons. So you see Joe Parrish here working on one of the skeletons. And just some tools in the process, reference manuals, and there's Brittany working on another. So we did this all through the winter, the next winter. And I'm just going to introduce you to a few of these people to give you a sense of the kind of information that we're able to pull from the skeletons, just from some basic analysis. So let's start with this one. There he is there. That's how he was on the ground. And this is what we can say about him. He was a male. He was about 5'9", so it was quite tall for the day. He was extremely muscular. He had strong neck, strong arms, strong legs, just very strong man. He had evidence of excessive upper arm strain and stress, so he's kind of a physical labor in his life. He was 30 to 40 years old. He smoked on the left side with a pipe. He had back stress, and he had evidence of nutrient deficiency. Now we know about the pipe smoking because the clay pipes they used to smoke, it was like even though they feel smooth, it's like a very fine sandpaper. And they'd break, and they'd use them, and they'd break, and they'd keep putting them in. It's always like a fresh sheet of sandpaper all the time. And they start to wear down your teeth into these circles, the circular area that you see there. And they smoked a lot. So a lot of the skeletons we saw in the cellar had these wearing on their teeth, so we could tell what side they smoked on. Sometimes both sides, sometimes one or the other. But it's just a little characteristic that you're able to draw from the skeletal remains. As you can see, it's quite clear on this gentleman. Okay, and now we'll move over here. And again, in situ. And notice again how broken up many of the bones are, and that's because of the heavy rock that was placed over them. So that complicated our ability to do some measurements and some recording because of the condition of the bones. So this was a female. She was relatively petite. She was about 5'3" in height, 40 to 49 years old. She had no evidence of arthritis, no evidence of nutrient deficiency. She kind of had a pretty good life, I think, based on the skeleton. She wasn't muscular. She didn't have a lot of physical labor in her life. But she had very severe dental wear, in particular compared to the other skeletons in the cellar. Now next to her was a child. And that's the child in situ. And now at that age you can't tell if it's a boy or a girl. The child was about 12 years old and had some incomplete fusion of a portion of the vertebrae. There was evidence of some heavy use on the upper arm muscles. And as I mentioned, he was buried next to a female, which is interesting to me. And Joe Parrish knows it's very unusual to find a child buried of this age. Usually children who make it through the early years carry through. But in this case, it's sort of an epidemic situation, so it's an unusual thing. And then on the other side of the petite lady is this individual. And you see him, again, notice the large stones. This is actually a good shot to see that. And this person had an amputated limb, as you can see there. And there he is. So he was a young man, 18 to 20 years old, and had his lower leg amputated below the knee. You could see the blade marks on the bone, so there's no sign of healing whatsoever, so he probably died shortly after the amputation took place. And he was close to the erosion line, so we've lost some information about him because of the erosion. But Joe did find portions of his lower right limb in the burial, indicating that he was probably buried with his severed leg. That one's a sad one for me. And we can go over here. And there he is. His skull has been removed at this point, in case that looks funny to some. He was a male, about 5'5.5" in height, 17 to 28 years old, pretty young. Some bad dentition, evidence of repetitive stress of the upper arm, so like an internal rotation of the arms toward the chest. Evidence of muscular strain on his left femur, his upper left leg, and evidence of nutrient deficiency again. We saw that again quite a bit.
Would that be like from rolling, maybe fishing and rolling boats?
Could be, yeah, or lifting or whatever could kind of give you that repetitive sort of impact. And then again on the beach in the eroding area, so again with incomplete information, we have two people here. And it's actually an adult female and a young child. Now, as mentioned, much was lost to erosion. There was a young child, about 3 to 4 years old, in the lap of this woman, a young woman, 15 to 18 years old, and she had considerable dental wear. So again, I wish we had known more, but there we go.
She smoked on the left or the right?
Hard to say, hard to say. But again, notice again, women and the child, that's twice we've seen that. And I came across mention, I think in Philip Barrier's book on burial practices, it comes up now and again, there's a mention of how they sometimes would bury children with women, or a woman, whether a relative or not, because they believed that comforted the child's spirit, and to keep them from sort of returning back into the community. And it would be interesting to know if say, the petite woman and the child were related, or if it was just a matter of putting women and children together. I don't know, but it was interesting that the two children that we found were next associated with women. And finally, one more. This gentleman in the back corner, he had a bit of a rough go. It's like, he was a male, I can't really read that, 50 to 55 years old, 5 foot 6 feet in height. He had 5 rib fracture events on his 3rd to 9th ribs, mostly on the left side, all healed, but different times he had his ribs broken and healed. Some of them healed better than others. He had mild arthritis on his upper back and neck. He had back pain and muscular strain, and he died a violent death. Aside from the young man with the amputation, this was the only other skeleton really that demonstrated this for sure. But he had, as you can see here, 2 very prominent square-shaped punctures through the side of his cranium, and there might have been a 3rd one as well too. So he was either pierced with a 2- or 3-prong tool. Accident or war-related, who knows? But that would have been what killed him. And he smoked a pipe on the right side.
Everybody.
Yeah, they did. And that's why we find so many pipe stems and pipe bowls at Louisbourg too, so it all comes together. So from looking at the skeletons, we're able to come up with some information. Now, from some of the skeletons, like 27 of the 45 individuals allowed us to get some information about the age. 14, we could get height, and 26, we could get gender. And notice it says male or probable male. Sometimes you don't have enough pieces to be sure, or there's sort of androgynous characteristics. So erring on the side of caution, it says probable male, but they're mostly male. So we see a pretty wide distribution in age ranges, and that's not totally surprising for militia. You're going to see that. There is mostly between the 21 to 30 years old. The height's all over the place too, but quite a few were tall for that time period. You see a number of them are 5'8", and again, mostly men, very typical for a garrison situation. So now we have this information, but what can we say? Like, how does this help us confirm or refute our assumption that this is a New England burial and not a French burial or something else? So I said, okay, let's take a look at a census. There's a wonderful census from the 1753 called the Sur-la-Ville Papers. And the troop major at Louisbourg did a census of 1,062 soldiers that were at Louisbourg at that time. Wonderful document. And I can't remember who gave it to me, Sandy or Ken or John, I don't know, but it's really come in handy. The ages, pretty much most people were younger than 35. Height-wise, the majority were between 5'4", 5'6". And the origins, most of them were from France. There were some from New France and a small percentage from Germany and Spain, but most of them were from France. So when I compared the two populations, now granted one's 1,000 and one's a very small data set from a cellar, but working with that, when I compared the height of the French soldiers to the height of the individuals of the cellar, doesn't really correlate terribly well. There's a lot of range and a lot of number of taller people in the cellar. When I compared the age ranges of the soldiers from the Sur-la-Ville Papers to what we found in the cellar, again, that doesn't really jive particularly well either. You see more older people or a broader range in the cellar. But again, this is just taking a glance at a potential data set. And then a little bit of science. So this wasn't me. This was done in 2010, 2011 by Brittany Ella Brooke and supervised, well, for her master's thesis at MUN and supervised by Vaughn Grime and also working with Joe Parrish at Cape Breton University. So they did isotope analysis, and I'm going to briefly mention it, but if you want to know anything more about it in any detail, her paper is online at the Memorial University library website, yes? Yeah. Yep. Or Brittany's right there. So isotope analysis, this was the thesis. So Brittany's thesis was to investigate the hypothesis that human remains within the cellar were New England soldiers that died in the winter of 1745-46 by performing isotopic analysis of the skeletal remains as a means of reconstructing their life histories. So what this looked at was the carbon, nitrogen, strontium, and oxygen isotopes of the bones and teeth. 40 individuals were looked at, and also 109 faunal samples, and those are faunal samples from Louisbourg, from inside the cellar, or another data set of faunal material from Louisbourg. And by example, here's a cow that we just recently dug at Louisbourg, and that would be an example of a good faunal sample for this type of study, although I think you work mostly with teeth.
Teeth and bone.
Teeth and bone, okay.
Yeah.
So just summing up the results of her thesis is like a tome. The carbon and nitrogen information, that's giving you information about the diet, whereas the oxygen and strontium is telling you more about the environment. So the faunal material was indicating a mixed terrestrial and marine-based plant system, ecosystem, whereas the humans, and this is the bones from within the cellar, are indicating more of a terrestrial carnivorous diet without significant marine content. And you wouldn't think for a coastal area like this that you would have a low marine content within those ranges. Looking at the oxygen, the faunal material was giving a mean delta oxygen 18 value, which was different from what the humans from the cellar were presenting. So there's a disconnect between the faunal and the human as well. And humans digested water at a higher O18 value than the faunal species. So it's showing some differences again. And the strontium, that was less conclusive than the other three studies. There was wide ranges, and humans had wide ranges, but not significantly different from the faunal material. So the conclusion of the paper was as follows. The group, and these are the skeletons from within the cellar, the group exhibited various diets. The isotopic variation is a strong indication that the groups are New Englanders, whereby the soldiers' various origins and occupations created a diversity of isotopic values. The lack of marine values is believed to be an indicator of the group's non-local origin. And the St. Marie individuals' drinking water delta Oxygen 18 values in comparison to New England precipitation mean delta O18 values show good agreement. So we looked at the Solarville papers, they show disagreement. We looked at the oxygen isotopes, it suggests that these people were from away too. So all these different, it's all sort of different ways of looking to see whether these people are New Englanders. We keep coming back to the fact that they were. And that's the paper. It's really long. I really summed it up. Okay, and so just concluding now. And something from an archaeological perspective is this find really taught us, or helped me, or take me back, or sort of away from the material and the, the objects and the walls and the buildings and the, the structural side of life, and remind us that when we're doing these sort of studies, we're really trying to get closer to the people from a different time period, and remember who they were and try to understand them better. It's not about the objects. The objects are just sort of like a tangible connection to the past, and this helped me sort of rebuild that understanding that it's people, people, people. So just to put a little face on some of these people I just introduced you to, I looked at some photos from the encampment, the last one that came through, and I was just looking through the pictures and pulling out ones that sort of represent similar, or may represent these skeletons. So let's start with the man in his 50s with all the rib fractures, arthritis and back pain, and the smoking the pipe on the right. He died a violent death with the skull punctures in the side of the head. So just to put a little face on him. And if anyone is in this crowd is in any of these pictures, it's by example. We also have a young man, 17 to 28 years old. Recapping, he carried out physical labor that strained his legs and caused repetitive stress of his upper arms, like lifting or rowing. He had poor dentition and not sufficient nutrients in his diet, and there was no clear cause of death, so probably, most likely, disease. Dysentery, diphtheria, the ones I mentioned. The young woman in her teens, buried with a 3 to 4-year-old child in her lap, probably related or not related, but either way, the child was cared for after death, and no clear sign of or cause of death, so again, probably disease, epidemic. A healthy young boy or girl, about 12 years of age, had a congenital or a genetic defect in the upper backbone that may or may not have been noticeable, carried out strenuous tasks like lifting or carrying, buried next to a woman, may or may not have been related, but clearly cared for after death, and no clear cause of death, so probably disease. We have the healthy 18 to 20-year-old man who died shortly after amputation to his right leg below the knee and possibly buried with a severed limb. Clear cause of death. Petite women in her 40s, not subject to much physical labor, lived a healthy life but had poor dentition. Sugar may have been involved with that. Buried next to a small child, and again, no clear cause of death, so probably disease or the epidemic. And a 30 to 40-year-old man, very strong and tall, smoked a pipe on his left, carried out physical labor, had back stress, did not obtain sufficient nutrients in his diets, and again, no clear cause of death, so probably disease. Now, of these people I introduced to you within the cellar, that's only 18%, and each one of the skeletons told their own story. So as we were working with them, you really saw this community grow and build. And we're actually very lucky that sort of nature has given us this opportunity, because as Joe puts it, this group of individuals represents one of the most unique collections of historical individuals in Canada, if not the world. These things don't happen very often. Okay, so just to recap, again with archaeology, it always seems to be about objects, and we always talk about objects, and we show objects, but they're always just a means to the end. And what we're really trying to get to is a sense of a different time, a different place, and the people of Louisbourg once upon a time. Thank you. I was going to say questions, but here we go.
No, just would you comment on, you said that dying at a rate of 19 a day. What was the total amount of mortality or deaths
Well, half the garrison, so it ranges between 800 to 1,200. Yes. Yeah. Except for those. Yeah.
I'm going to kind of ties in, I'm wondering if the other two burned out properties, you anticipate that probably they're similar.
Well, yes. Oh, I forgot that slide. Okay, so there was a plan. I was thinking about this. So there was a plan from 1746 that shows these odd features out on Rochefort Point, and they're not well explained. Actually, they're not explained at all. We know the properties were destroyed in 1745, so I don't know what they're illustrating out here because it should be really nothing. The large square, well, I'll show you. This is the area of interest, and when you compare from the 1744 map, when there were buildings there seems to be a pretty good correlation between the structures and the cemetery, and I have a feeling that they are illustrating mass grave locations, but just not really saying so. And there also was a record of that the French had created a mass grave within their cemetery as well too, and that could be possibly what that's referring to. So the Carreau property is eroding, and we have been looking for the cellar because we'd much rather locate it and deal with it before the coastline gets to it, because that changes everything, the rate of everything and the loss. So, and it's a tricky site, this one. It's not giving up its secrets very easily. We did find the house. So this is like a back-to-back fireplace you're seeing here, and burnt floorboards. All this black here are all the burnt floorboards, but it's absolutely peppered with post-1745 18th century burials. So it's pretty tricky to follow features because they keep disappearing. So we have the house, can't find the cellar yet, but that's probably the case. Why, if you used one cellar, then most likely you used others. Yes?
Were you surprised to find women and children?
Women and children? Not really. I mean, usually when you have a garrison, there's always women. They tend not to get written about. It's mostly about the men, but the officers, there's a limited number of women that they would allow, but there was officers tending to have wives. The camp followers, they usually have a number of women as well there too. So finding them wasn't a surprise, and finding so few of them was also kind of expected as well. And children, some children, not many, but there would be some.
As I recall at the time, one of the skeletal remains showed signs of the individual having been hanged, or at least it was theorized at the time. Is there any more work been done on that?
Just where it was left, there was some wear on that those vertebrae, which aren't really easy to explain. That it appears to be as if someone was hung, but it's I don't know. It's there, but it's not conclusive. You probably kind of want to have more evidence than what's presented there, mostly because the bones were so impacted by the rocks on top of them. It looks like it, but I don't know.
Would you find jewelry of any type?
No, actually I didn't mention that most of the burials, they were shroud burials. Actually, it's a good point. I meant to say that. They were shroud burials. And they appeared to have been dressed down possibly in a chemise because we weren't finding buttons and buckles and things like that. We were finding pins now and again that we believe are shroud pins that are associated in and around the burials, but not much. Very little.
Were you able to recover any DNA and trace the genealogy to their ancestors in Massachusetts?
We haven't done any DNA analysis on these skeletons. But we had done DNA analysis on a previous eroding burial, like an individual eroding burial. Actually, that was an interesting point from the paper as well, too, that the isotope analysis from that individual, who was associated with a coin from 1742 and believed to be associated with New England burial, had matching isotopic values or that correlated well with these people. But no, we haven't done any DNA on them.
Do you think about doing DNA?
Hadn't really initially, because what we wanted to do was do some basic analysis and then get everybody into the crypt for a respectful interment, maybe down the road. But it's also very expensive to do DNA analysis too. So unless we're looking for something very specific or need to know something very specific, then I don't know.
Is there any interest in this in New England? towards the end of the 19th century, they put up that monument to the daughters of colonial or whatever. Have they had any interest ever since in what happened to their ancestors?
Right after it happened, I was getting some emails and interest, and the media picked up on it down there. But we presented in conferences down there to make sure it was well known. The Smithsonian physical anthropologists there are looking at the data now and possibly correlating it with their study of sort of like, you know, American history, drawing that in. So at the Smithsonian, there's interest.
Is that why the War of 1812, why the New Englanders didn't participate in that War of 1812? Because they were loyal to the Canadians or British?
The New Englanders? Well, that's a question for an historian who's right beside you. And on the other side of you, too. Yeah. So I'm going to redirect that back to those.
They just weren't in the groove for that.
I just know that we were doing trade with them during the war.
Well, there was some sea warfare with them, the capture of the channel by the Chesapeake in the War of 1812. A big deal. Not a whole lot. It's mostly upper Canadian.
Yeah. But there was a lot in Halifax. Halifax was a very important port. And they did a lot of trade with New England, Massachusetts.
Okay, so anyone? Oh, yes?
Thank you. This is a very important part of history.
I think so.
Yeah, I do agree. I know the topography just a little bit from being out around there, and the south side is much more rugged, so therefore hopefully more protected. When you're talking about the northeasters coming in and doing the damage. Have we, as Canadian government people, not strive to protect the shoreline a little more here with armor stone, concrete, et cetera, like we did with the Royal Battery?
We have. Sort of the way we're approaching coastal erosion and how to deal with all this losses is changing. In the past, they would put barriers up against what were deemed very special locations or special sites, say the Princess Bastion or the Royal Battery, and that works great. But there's many sections of the coastline that have cultural resources. Louisbourg is just covered with cultural resources, and they're everywhere. And some we know about, and some we really don't. Say, you know, this feature is a good example of that. So we can't cover the whole coastline. It's wildly expensive, and it doesn't always work. And also, when you put a barrier up, it'll deflect energy someplace else. It won't go away, and you can also affect sediment flows and all. It gets very complicated. The coastline is such a dynamic, wonderfully dynamic location that you really have to be careful what to do. And also, aesthetically, you can really change the whole appearance of a coastline with a whole lot of barriers. So what we started doing was more of a triage approach. We said, okay, let's pull as much information together as we can, get a good sense of where cultural resources are or are anticipated, look at our most vulnerable sections of the coastline, what's being hit the hardest, which has the softest sediment and things like that, and prioritize the response. And what's going to happen now is probably a whole variety of responses. Some places may warrant or get an engineered option. It could be an offshore barrier, an onshore barrier, or sometimes it could be rescue excavation, or sometimes you just have to let things go. So that's the approach that we're sort of looking at now, looking at all the options and trying to make kind of a really broad overview of, or have a broader overview of the whole area and record and rescue what we can. But we still go out and do these coastal surveys constantly, so that doesn't stop.
Excuse me, did you find any coins?
Not that I recall, maybe at the floor of the cellar.
Coins like money?
Not really. I mean, from an archaeological perspective, they're not my favorite artifacts. Because they don't give, I'm looking for information. I want data. I want an artifact that tells me something. And coins can be in use for so long. Like, you can have a coin that could be 100 years old and it's not going to give me what I'm looking for.
More like silver nuggets or coins?
No. Actually, what I like is like a smoking pipe. It's dateable. It preserves well. Those are my favorite things.
Did they have gold on when they were buried?
Did they have what?
Clothes.
I think they probably just had like a chemise. You know, that's that long shirt that they wore at the time, but that's about it. Yep.
Was there any religious artifacts, like crucifixes or medallions in the graves?
Not a thing.
Nothing?
Nothing. Not much like some pins, really. I mean, we weren't really finding much at all associated with the burials.
So do you think everything was taken from them?
I don't know. I don't know what was going on. I know it was a very desperate time, so I'm not sure how that played out. But we didn't find any.
I ask you, do you think the fact that there was no religious artifacts found, especially in a burial position like that, would that be some indication of the fact that they were New Englanders as opposed to French?
I don't know, because any of the other burials that were found, I don't recall anybody being found with religious artifacts from that time period at Louisbourg. Yeah, I know sometimes the adornments, it's something that changes over time, what you're buried with or how you're buried. That process changes, and I think at this time period, there wasn't a lot that was put in the grave.
It was a grid type, maybe, like 2 layers,
Pardon?
like a grid type?
Grid type?
Yeah. They were laid out in a grid.
Very orderly, yeah. There was definite care taken to put them in the cellar in a very specific way. So, very tight, head to toe, so they were packed in very tightly, but carefully. Okay, thanks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming up on the hour, so
wait, there's
one more question?
One more question?
I was just wondering, I didn't understand why it's so unique, this grave site, compared to other battlefields and grave sites.
Why it was unique?
The last statement you made there about one of the most unique discoveries or grave sites there.
Well, I guess what's different about this one is it wasn't in the battle, like it wasn't of the battle. It was about a community after the battle. So you have, like I said, like a snapshot of time there of people who probably all knew each other, who all lived together and were dying together. So it gives you, that's what's probably the most unusual thing about it. You don't really get that very often.
Were there any requests from New England to move the internment somewhere in the United States?
No, I haven't heard anything, and that's perfectly valid. So if, yeah, that could be done if that was wanted.
You say they should be honored?
Pardon?
They should be honored like as soldiers?
I don't know, but I mean, the best thing that we can do now is just respect them, and that's what having them in the crypt and left alone is basically what we're trying to do.
I think George's Island, they have burial sites there,
And yeah.
and the Americans are finally recognizing their mission.
Well, there may be interest in time, for something like that. And so like I said, the door is always open for ideas. And great.
Well, Becky, on behalf of everybody here in the Old Sydney Society, all our members and guests, I want to thank you for a stimulating talk, for taking us back in time. And you can see all the careful research that goes on. It's 10 years, I think, since Becky first discovered that site. And
10
should be
years.
publishing it, so it takes a lot of homework. So we have a beautiful book here by Liz Doherty, The Cape Breton Fiddle Companion. It's incredible. I've read it. It's a tour through Cape Breton history. So we'd like to present this to you for,
Thank you very
for the
much.
talk this evening. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
So we have some tea in china cups and refreshments.
Did I see fudge over there? Was that
Yes,
like
you
fudge?
did.
Did you say there was fudge over there?